how can I do that?
Yeah.
I already am what I am. So how can I aspire? It's already in me. So talk about that.
Yeah, I think this is like the deepest part of the book. And this is a puzzle that I've been puzzling over basically like as far back as I can remember, which is, it looks like, suppose that I become someone new. Suppose that I do it. Okay. Right. That is, there's some fundamental change in me. Well, it looks like there are two possibilities. One of them is that the antecedents of that change were already buried in the old me. We often talk this way when we talk about talents or innate predispositions or whatever. It's like the statue being hidden in the marble or something, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one possibility, which is to say I didn't really change. That other thing was there at the beginning. We just didn't see it, right? Yeah. The other possibility is like, no, there really is this radical shift. But then we want to say, okay, but then I didn't do it. Then that change is just something that happened to me that came from the outside. And so it looks like self-creation, where what you mean by that is turning yourself into something that really is substantively new and different from what you had before, is impossible. It's like a logical contradiction, right? So that's one of the puzzles that I try to address in the book. And what I say is that, the mistake that we make when we set up this puzzle is that we assume that what it means for the later self to sort of have antecedents in the earlier self, right? What it means for the fact that there is some kind of continuity between the two is that in a certain way you can sort of derive the later self from the earlier self. Here's an example, a real example of how philosophers have actually talked about this. You could think of the earlier self as making a promise, mm-hmm. like this is what I'm going to be like, and then the later self as keeping that promise. Okay. And like the problem is like, why did the earlier self make that promise, right? Yeah. So that kind of model where the earlier self makes a decision or a commitment or in some sense shapes or governs or is in charge of the later self, right? That's going to get you into one side of the dilemma, which is to say, it's both like, well, then there was not a real substantive change. And then there's also the question, how did you get to that position? And there's a regress, right? But what I want to say is that you can conceive of the continuity between the earlier and the later self, less like that, less like somebody making a promise and then living up to it, and more like something like, here's another way we use the word promise, seeing something as promising, right? Seeing that there is something out there and you don't get it or grasp it, you don't master it, you're not in charge of it. And you have this sense that if you work your way there, it's your later self who's going to be authoritative. It's your later self who will judge you. You don't get to judge her, right? She's going to be like, yeah, when I was younger, I totally, just like you said, my earlier stuff, like I used to screw this up. I didn't quite get it, right? And so the big mistake that sets up the paradox and makes it seem like self-creation is impossible is that we assume that if there's going to be any relation of continuity between the earlier and the later self, the earlier one has to be the authoritative one. And what I want to argue is that the later one is the authoritative one. And we're sort of working our way up. We're not in charge of or shaping or governing or molding or making our future selves.